The neon glare of a flickering sign tore through the shadows of the narrow alleyway at 1 a.m. on a rain-slicked Tuesday night. Hana, dressed in light blue pajamas with her hair in a messy bun, felt her heart hammer against her ribs as she leveled a heavy shotgun at the dark figure of Min Soo, the stalker who had turned her life into a nightmare of hypervigilance. Before she could pull the trigger, the blinding beam of a black SUV's headlights flooded the alley, and a tall man in a sharp black suit with a sprawling floral neck tattoo stepped into the light. He moved with the lethal elegance of a predator, ignoring the weapon in Hana's shaking hands as he looked down at the motionless, blood-stained body of her pursuer. Fixing her with an intense, storm-cold gaze, he issued a chilling decree. "I just cleaned up your mess. Now, your life belongs to me." Hana was a young woman living in a state of constant terror, her world shrunk to the size of her small apartment by Min Soo's relentless obsession and a past trauma she couldn't escape. Her savior was Daehyun Park, the ruthless head of a powerful Korean Mafia syndicate currently locked in a bloody transition of power. Daehyun was being squeezed by internal rivals who viewed his lack of a stable heir as a weakness to be exploited. Seeing an opportunity in the girl with the shotgun, Daehyun offered a dark deal with the devil. In exchange for the cleanup of her stalker, Hana would act as his fiancée to solidify his standing. But Hana, refusing to be just another piece of property, issued her own condition. To prove he wasn't a monster, the Mafia boss would have to leave his empire behind and live a normal life inside her modest apartment. The heavy silence of the alleyway was broken only by the wet, rhythmic ticking of the radiator from Hana's old studio apartment nearby and the jagged sound of her own breathing. She stood paralyzed, the weight of her father's old shotgun pulling at her small frame, the barrel still aimed at the space where Min Soo had been standing seconds ago. Now, there was only a crimson smear on the concrete, and the motionless form of the man who had stalked her for months. The glare from the black SUV's headlights was blinding, casting the tall figure in front of her into a sharp, terrifying silhouette. Daehyun Park didn't flinch at the weapon in her hands. He didn't even glance at it. He stepped forward, the expensive fabric of his trousers narrowly avoiding the pool of dark fluid spreading across the pavement. His eyes, sharp as winter ice and twice as cold, swept over her light blue pajamas and the messy bun that had begun to come undone in her panic. "You were going to pull the trigger," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "It wasn't a question. But you would have missed. Your hands are shaking too hard and your stance is all wrong." Hana swallowed, her throat feeling as though it were lined with glass. "Who are you? Is he dead?" Dan finally looked down at the body of Min Soo. He nudged the man's shoulder with the toe of a polished leather shoe, his expression one of bored indifference. "He is a problem that has been removed. A cleanup you were clearly incapable of performing yourself." He turned back to her, the flickering neon sign above them catching the intricate petals of the floral tattoo that climbed his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt. "The question isn't who I am, Hana. The question is how you intend to pay for the service I just provided." "I didn't ask for your help," Hana whispered, though her grip on the shotgun faltered. The sheer presence of the man was suffocating, a kind of power that made the air in the alley feel thin and electric. Daehyun took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to back up until her shoulder blades hit the cold brick of the building. He reached out, not to touch her, but to wrap his hand around the barrel of the shotgun, effortlessly tilting it away from his chest. "In my world, there is no such thing as a free life," he murmured, leaning down until she could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and something metallic. "I stepped in. I took the blood onto my hands so it wouldn't stain yours. That creates a debt, Hana. A debt that cannot be settled with the meager savings I know you don't have." Hana looked into his gray eyes and saw the same unhidden desperation she felt, though his was buried under layers of steel and silk. "What do you want from me?" "I need a wife," he stated, the absurdity of the demand clashing with the brutal reality of the body lying 10 feet away. "My organization is in chaos. My father's will requires a partner to stabilize my claim. or the men who sent that pathetic creature after you will take everything I've built." He let go of the gun and straightened his suit jacket, his composure cracking for only a fraction of a second as he watched her reaction. "You have no family left to miss you, no one to ask questions, and a life that was already forfeit to a stalker. I am offering you a trade. I erase your fear, and in return, you give me your life. You belong to the Sinclair, to the Park family now." Hannah looked at the ring of men standing in the shadows behind the SUV, their faces unreadable, and then back at the man who looked like a king begging for a miracle. She felt the weight of the debt pressing into her chest. "If I agree," she said, her voice dry as dust, "you come live here, in my apartment. No guards, no black cars. I need to know if you're a monster before I tie my name to yours." Dayan paused, his eyes searching hers as if seeing something he hadn't encountered in years. Then he gave a sharp, decisive nod. "Agreed. Pack your things, Hannah. Our marriage begins at dawn." The transition from the blood-stained pavement of the alley to the cramped, lavender-scented air of Hannah's studio apartment happened with a disorienting speed. Dayan Park did not bring a convoy. True to his word, he dismissed the black SUVs at the curb and ascended the narrow, creaking stairs alone, carrying a single leather suitcase that cost more than everything Hannah owned. When he stepped inside, the apartment seemed to shrink. His presence was too large for the peeling wallpaper and the thrift store furniture that crowded the room. He stood in the center of the kitchenette, his tailored black suit an abrasive contrast to the soft, worn rug and the stack of library books on the counter. Hannah watched him from the doorway, still in her rumpled blue pajamas, feeling the absurdity of the moment settle over her like a heavy blanket. "The sofa pulls out," she said, her voice sounding small in the quiet room. "I have extra blankets in the trunk by the window. It's not a palace, but it's private." Dayan didn't complain. He set his suitcase down with a decisive click and looked around the space with an unreadable expression. He wasn't used to the silence of a normal home. His world was built on the hum of server rooms and the hushed whispers of subordinates. Here, the only sound was the refrigerator's low rattle and the distant siren of a city that didn't know a kingpin was sleeping on a pull-out couch. The first morning brought a new kind of tension. Hannah woke at dawn, her habit of hypervigilance refusing to break even with a predator guarding her door. She found Dayan already awake, sitting at her small bistro table with his laptop open. He had shed his jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink that spiraled down to his wrists. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept at all. "You don't sleep," she observed, moving toward the kitchen. "Sleep is a luxury for people who aren't hunted," he replied without looking up, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he managed a crumbling empire from a 400-square-foot room. Hannah reached for the old French press, but stopped. She looked at him, a man who had probably never stepped foot in a kitchen without a chef, and felt a strange, defiant spark. If he was going to live in her world, he had to learn the rhythm of it. "If you want to stay here, you need to be useful," she said, sliding the glass carafe toward him. "I don't serve guests. I'll show you once. Pay attention." She expected a flare of temper, a reminder of his status, but Dayan went still. He closed his laptop and stood, moving into her space with a slow, watchful grace. Hannah talked him through the process, the coarse grind of the beans, the temperature of the water, the 4-minute wait that required a patience he rarely practiced. He watched her hands with a terrifying intensity, as if he were memorizing a tactical maneuver. When it was his turn to press the plunger, his large, scarred hand moved with surprising gentleness. He didn't rush. He didn't demand. He simply followed her lead, his gray eyes fixed on the swirl of the dark liquid. "It's simple," he murmured, pouring the coffee into a chipped ceramic mug. "Most things in this world are," Hannah replied, taking the cup from him. For a brief second, their fingers brushed, a spark of electricity that made her heart stumble out of its rhythm. She stepped back quickly, her eyes sliding away from his. Dayan took a sip, the bitter heat seemingly grounding him. For the first time since the alley, the cold composure on his face cracked, replaced by a hint of something human. He looked out the window at the mundane street below, a man who had traded a throne for a studio apartment, and for a moment, he didn't look like a monster. Better than the office, he admitted quietly. Hana leaned against the counter, watching the most dangerous man in the city try to navigate her tiny kitchen. They were two broken souls trying to learn a new language, one cup of coffee at a time. The transition from the quiet safety of the studio apartment to the cold opulence of the Grand Hyatt ballroom was like stepping from a sanctuary into a lion's den. Hana stood before the full-length mirror, adjusting the silk of a deep emerald gown that Daehyun had arranged for her. It was elegant but modest, a sharp contrast to the light blue pajamas she had worn just days ago. Beside her, Daehyun adjusted his cufflinks, his sharp black suit returning him to his role as a kingpin. The floral tattoo on his neck was partially hidden by his collar, but the intensity in his gray eyes remained as sharp as a blade. "You don't have to speak," Daehyun murmured, his voice low and grounding against the rising tide of her anxiety. "Just stay beside me. My world is full of people waiting for a moment of weakness. Don't give it to them." Hana drew a deep breath and lifted her chin, the pride of a survivor surfacing beneath the silk. "I told you before, Daehyun. Don't underestimate me." When they entered the gala, the air in the room seemed to pull tight, like a drawn wire. Crystal chandeliers scattered light like shards of ice over a crowd of men in tailored suits and women draped in diamonds. Every head turned. The whispers followed them like surf, thick with scrutiny and contempt. They were the center of a storm, and Hana could feel the weight of their judgment. She was an outsider, a girl from a world they considered beneath them. A man approached them with a smile that never reached his ice-cold eyes. It was Kang-ho, Daehyun's primary rival within the syndicate, a man who carried his ambition like a weapon. He looked Hana up and down with open disdain, his gaze lingering on her simple jewelry. "So, this is the prize you found in the gutter, Daehyun?" Kang-ho asked, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "I heard rumors you'd gone soft, hiding away in a studio apartment. Does she still smell like cheap coffee and fear?" A few nearby associates chuckled, the sound sharp and ugly. Hana felt the heat rush into her face, but she didn't retreat. She felt Daehyun go rigid beside her, his hand clenching into a fist, his gray eyes darkening with a dangerous, murderous light. Before he could speak, before the violence could erupt, Hana stepped forward. She met Kang-ho's eyes without flinching, her voice steady and clear in the sudden silence of the hall. "It's interesting that you mentioned smell," she said, a thin, cold smile touching her lips. "Because from where I stand, the only thing I can smell is the desperation of a man who has to insult a woman just to feel powerful. Is that how you lead? By hiding behind mockery because you're too afraid to lead with honor?" The room fell deathly silent. Kang-ho's fake smile stiffened, his face flushing with a mixture of shock and rage. No one in the syndicate dared to speak to him that way, let alone a country girl with no status. Daehyun stepped in front of Hana, placing himself between her and the threat, his presence filling the space like a shield. "She told you the truth, Kang-ho," Daehyun said, his voice low and vibrating with a lethal promise. "If you insult my fiancé again, you'll learn exactly how soft I've become. And you won't like the lesson." Kang-ho stared at them for a long moment, the air heavy with the threat of bloodshed, before he finally backed away with a tight, resentful nod. As he vanished into the crowd, Hana felt the adrenaline begin to fade, leaving her heart pounding like a war drum. Daehyun turned to her, and for a brief second the mask of the Mafia boss slipped. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, respect, perhaps even a trace of wonder. He reached out, his hand resting briefly against the small of her back. "You surprised me," he whispered, his voice gentler than it had been all night. "I told you," Hana replied, her breathing slowly returning to rhythm. "I know how to stand my ground." They walked through the rest of the evening hand in hand, and for the first time since the alley, Hana realized she wasn't just a pawn in his game. She was the only person in the room who truly saw the man behind the tattoo, and he was the only one standing between her and the dark. The adrenaline of the gala lingered like a bitter aftertaste, long after the engine of the SUV had cut out. Back in the cramped stillness of the studio apartment, the city's neon signs bled through the thin curtains, casting long, rhythmic bars of electric blue and magenta across the floor. Hana stood by the window, her fingers trembling as she unzipped the emerald silk dress, the transition back to her reality, feeling like a physical weight. Behind her, Daehyun sat on the edge of the pull-out sofa, his tie discarded and his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the full, tangled beauty of the floral tattoo that anchored him to a world of violence. "You should have let me handle Kang-ho," Daehyun said, his voice cutting through the dark. It wasn't an admonishment, but there was a tremor of suppressed tension in it. "In my world, silence is often a better shield than a sharp tongue." Hana turned, her silhouette framed by the glowing city. "In my world, silence is what gets you killed," she countered softly. "I spent months being silent while Min-soo followed me. I'm done being a ghost." Daehyun looked up, the neon light catching the pale scar that ran along his jawline, a silent testament to a life spent in the crosshairs. For a long moment, the ruthless head of the syndicate was gone, replaced by a man who looked profoundly alone in the middle of a crowded city. He leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "I was 16 the first time I held a gun," he murmured, the words falling like stones into a deep well. "My father didn't ask if I was ready, he simply handed it to me when a rival gang breached our gates. I took a life that night to save his, and the scariest part wasn't the blood, it was that I felt nothing at all." Anna moved toward him, sitting in the worn armchair across from the sofa, the distance between them filled with the heavy scent of rain and old books. "You feel something now," she whispered. "I saw it when you looked at Kang-ho. It wasn't just anger, it was fear for me." Daehyun's throat moved as he swallowed. "My mother was the only light I had," he continued, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "She died when I was young, and my father hid her illness from me, claiming she just needed rest. The night she called for me, I told her I'd come in tomorrow because I was busy with some trivial game. There was no tomorrow. I never got to say goodbye, and I've spent every night since wondering what she wanted to tell me." The confession hung in the air, raw and unshielded. Hana felt a phantom ache in her own chest, the memory of a hospital call she had received 2 years prior surfacing with a vengeance. "I didn't get to say goodbye either," she said, her voice shaking. "My parents were farmers. They were coming back from the market when a truck with failed brakes hit them. I arrived at the hospital too late. I don't even remember the last time I told them I loved them." She looked at her hands, small and calloused, so different from his, yet carrying the same weight of regret. "That's why I couldn't let Min-soo take this place from me. It's all I have left of them." Daehyun stood and crossed the small gap between them, kneeling on the rug in front of her chair. He didn't reach for her, respecting the boundaries they had drawn in the dirt of that alleyway, but his presence was a warm, grounding force. "They know, Hana," he said, his gray eyes shimmering with a sudden startling gentleness. "You don't have to say the words for them to know you loved them. You're living for them. That's enough." Hana reached out, her fingers grazing the ink on his forearm, feeling the heat of his skin beneath the tattoo. In the flickering neon light, they weren't a mafia boss and a victim. They were just two broken souls finding recognition in the one place they never thought to look. "Stay," she whispered, the word a fragile bridge across the dark. "I don't want to be alone with the ghosts tonight." Daehyun nodded, his gaze searching hers with a devotion that felt more dangerous than any threat from the syndicate. "I'm here," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere." The fragile peace of the studio apartment was shattered 3 days later by a single, vibrating phone on the scarred wooden table. Daehyun took the call in the kitchenette, his posture stiffening into a familiar, lethal rigidity as he listened. Hana watched him from the sofa, the morning sunlight feeling suddenly cold. When he hung up, his gray eyes were no longer the warm pools she had seen under the neon lights. They were shards of flint. "Dante found something in the cleanup of the alley," Daehyun said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous rasp. He tossed a tablet onto the cushion beside her, displaying a series of encrypted messages recovered from Min-soo's burner phone. "Your stalker wasn't just a disturbed loner with an obsession, Hana. He was being paid." Hana felt the air leave her lungs as she scrolled through the logs. The messages detailed her daily routine with terrifying precision. What time she watered the plants, which route she took to the library, and even the moments she sat alone on her porch at night. But it was the sender's signature that made her blood turn to ice. The payments hadn't come from a private account. They were routed through a shell company owned by the Sinclair, the Park conglomerate. Min-soo was a pawn, Dae-hyun murmured, pacing the small room like a caged animal. He was hired to turn your life into a living hell, to isolate you until you were desperate enough for anyone to step in. My brother, Adrian, or in this case, my rival, Kang-ho, didn't just want me to find a wife. He wanted to ensure that the woman I chose was someone already broken, someone he could easily crush to get to me. The realization hit Hana like a physical blow. The terror she had endured for months hadn't been an accident of fate. It was a calculated tactical maneuver designed to manipulate the head of the syndicate. She stood up, her legs trembling but her gaze fixed on Dae-hyun. So, saving me in the alley? That was exactly what they wanted you to do? They expected me to buy you, use you, and discard you once the inheritance was secure, Dae-hyun replied, stopping in front of her. His hand reached out, his thumb grazing the faint bruise on her cheek left by the struggle in the basement of her memory. They didn't account for you having a spine of steel, and they certainly didn't account for me actually caring what happens to you. Hana looked at the tablet again, seeing the cold, calculated way her fear had been monetized. The monster she had feared in the alley was nothing compared to the men sitting in high-backed chairs at the syndicate gala, orchestrating her misery from behind mahogany desks. This isn't just about a stalker anymore, she whispered, the survival instinct that had kept her alive for 2 years sharpening into a blade. If Kang-ho is behind this, he won't stop until he proves our transaction is a fraud. He'll come for me again, won't he? Dae-hyun's grip on her shoulder tightened, a vow of protection that felt more binding than any contract they had signed. He can try. But he made one fatal mistake. He thought he was giving me a victim to exploit. Instead, he gave me the only reason I have to win. Under the pale morning light, the studio apartment no longer felt like a cramped refuge. It felt like a fortress under siege. The shadow of Min-soo had faded, only to be replaced by a much larger, more lethal darkness that reached into the very heart of the empire Dae-hyun was trying to hold. The revelation that her torment had been a corporate strategy shifted something fundamental in the air of the studio. The apartment was silent, the hum of the city outside muffled by the thick glass, leaving Hana and Dae-hyun in a vacuum of shared realization. Hana sat at the small bistro table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug, while Dae-hyun stood by the window, his back to her. The tension that usually vibrated between them, a mixture of suspicion and forced proximity, had smoothed out into something heavier and more profound. The contract said 1 year, Hana said softly, her voice cutting through the stillness. It said $2 million and my debt erased in exchange for a performance. But Kang-ho didn't just write a contract, he wrote a script for my life before you even arrived at that gate. Dae-hyun turned away from the window. The cold, calculating mask he wore for the syndicate was gone, leaving behind the man who had learned to brew coffee in her chipped mugs and fix the latch on her window. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate, until he was standing just inches from her chair. I didn't know, he murmured, his gray eyes searching hers for any sign of the fear he had accidentally inherited. I came to that alley because I needed a way to win. I thought I was finding a partner in a transaction. I didn't realize I was stepping into a trap set with your tears. Hana looked up at him, seeing not the monster who had demanded her life as payment, but the man who had sat beside her during her nightmares. The distance between them, once a chasm of mafia politics and survival, had shrunk to nothing. The contract was still there, sitting in a leather briefcase on her counter, but it felt like a relic from a different life. You could leave, she whispered, her heart stumbling in her chest. Now that we know Kang-ho is the one pulling the strings, you could find another way. You don't have to live in this tiny room. You don't have to protect a farm girl who has nothing to offer you but a cup of coffee and a shared grief. Dae-hyun reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his fingers finally grazed her jawline. His touch was hesitant, a stark contrast to the man who had dropped a stalker with a single blow. I have everything to lose if I stay, he admitted, his voice rough with a truth he had never dared to name. My empire, my standing, my safety. But if I leave, I lose the only thing that makes me feel like a man instead of a weapon. Hana stood, her movement bringing her into the circle of his warmth. She realized then that the deal had expired long ago. It wasn't about the $150,000 debt or the Sinclair inheritance anymore. It was about the way he looked at her when the world wasn't watching. As if she were his last hope. She reached up, her small, calloused hands framing his face, her thumbs smoothing the sharp line of his jaw. Then don't stay for the contract, she said, her breath hitching. Stay because you want to. Daehyun didn't hesitate. He leaned down, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was a world away from the formal, icy touch of their wedding day. This was real, slow, desperate, and filled with the honesty of two people who had spent their lives hiding behind armor. It was a kiss that acknowledged the blood on his hands and the scars on her heart, trading the safety of a business deal for the dangerous territory of love. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, the neon light of the city painting them in shades of blue and gold. The contract was just paper now. The choice was made. In the quiet of the studio, the Mafia boss and the farm girl had found a home in each other, and neither of them was afraid of the dark anymore. The fragile sanctuary of the studio apartment was destroyed with the clinical precision of a military operation. It happened on a Tuesday, while Daehyun was in the city finalizing a merger, a rare moment of separation that Kang-ho had been waiting for with the patience of a viper. Hana was alone, the familiar scent of brewing coffee still lingering in the air when the heavy steel of the door was kicked from its hinges. She didn't have time to reach for the shotgun. A gloved hand clamped over her mouth, the sharp chemical sting of a sedative flooding her lungs before the world tilted into an abyss of darkness. When she woke, the lavender-scented air was gone, replaced by the damp, metallic stench of an abandoned warehouse on the city's edge. Her hands were bound with rough cord, and her ankles were chained to a freezing concrete floor. In the dim light of a single flickering bulb, Kang-ho sat in a folding chair, watching her with the same disdain he had shown at the gala. I warned him that a girl from the gutter would be his undoing, Kang-ho sneered, leaning forward so she could smell the expensive tobacco on his breath. He's already dismantling the shell companies. He's liquidating assets. He's throwing away an empire for a transaction that was never meant to be real. Hana pushed herself upright against the cold wall, her cheek burning where a rough hand had struck her. It stopped being a transaction the moment he chose to stay in that room, she said, her voice raspy but unbroken. You think you're taking his power, but you're just proving you're too small to understand what he actually values. The response from the city was not a negotiation. It was an inferno. Daehyun didn't call the council or wait for the legal proceedings of the syndicate. He mobilized every soldier loyal to his name and burned every bridge he had built to maintain the peace. To get her back, he handed over the keys to the Sinclair, the Park legacy, authorizing the transfer of the very territories Kang-ho had spent a decade coveting. He traded the crown for the girl in the light blue pajamas. The warehouse doors were torn open by the roar of engines and the shattering of glass. Daehyun stepped through the wreckage alone, his black suit covered in the dust of the assault, his gray eyes burning with a primal, terrifying focus. He didn't look at Kang-ho. He didn't look at the men holding weapons. His gaze locked onto Hana, finding her in the dark. I told you, Daehyun said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that silenced the room. If you touched her, I would make you disappear from this earth. The violence that followed was swift and absolute. Daehyun moved like a force of nature, dropping his rivals with a brutality that left even his own men in shock. When he reached Hana, his hands were shaking, not with fear of the men around him, but with the sheer, crushing weight of nearly losing her. He dropped to his knees, his fingers fumbling with the ropes that bit into her wrists. Hana? He choked out, pulling her into his arms as the ropes fell away. I thought the light was out. I thought I'd never see you again. Hana clung to him, her face buried in the crook of his neck, feeling the rapid, frantic beat of his heart. I'm here, she whispered through tears of relief. I knew you'd come for me. In that dark, broken place, the empire was gone, traded for a life. And as Daehyun kissed her amid the chaos and the smoke, they both knew that the debt was finally, truly paid. The aftermath of the extraction left the syndicate in a state of tectonic shifting, but inside the familiar, narrow walls of the studio apartment, the air was eerily still. Daehyun stood by the small kitchenette, no longer the untouchable kingpin of the Park Empire, but a man who had intentionally set fire to his own throne. He had spent the last 48 hours signing away territories, liquidating offshore accounts, and transferring the keys to the conglomerate to a neutral council. The price for Hana's safety had been the very thing he had spent his entire life protecting, yet as he looked at her sitting on the sofa, he didn't look like a man who had lost anything at all. "It's done," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to ground the room. He walked over and sat beside her, the expensive fabric of his suit jacket finally discarded for the last time. "The papers are filed. I've abdicated. The Park family name no longer carries a crown, only a history." Hana reached out, her fingers tracing the faded bruise on his jaw where he had fought to reach her in the warehouse. "You gave up everything, Daehyun. The power, the legacy, the empire. All of it for me." "I didn't give up everything," he countered, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world feel like a distant memory. "I gave up a prison. I traded a life of looking over my shoulder for the chance to look at you." He took her hand, his thumbs smoothing over the knuckles that had once gripped a shotgun in terror. "Kang-ho has what he wanted. He has the debt, the land, and the darkness. He thinks he won because he understands power, but he'll never understand why a man would choose a soul over an empire." The weight of the sacrifice hung between them, a staggering debt that Hana knew she could never truly repay, yet the way Daehyun looked at her suggested the debt was already settled. He had walked away from the Council of Five Families without a single backward glance, leaving behind the blood and the gold for the quiet reality of a 400-square-foot room. He was no longer a monster to be feared by the city, but a man who was learning how to be whole. "I'm not a good man, Hana," he whispered, the shadows of his past momentarily flickering in his gaze. "I've done things that can't be erased by a signature on an abdication paper. I've destroyed families to build my own." Hana moved closer, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart that was no longer made of stone. "The man who did those things stayed in that warehouse," she said softly. "The man who is sitting here is the one who chose to save me twice, once from a stalker and once from the darkness of your own world." Daehyun pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierce, protective gentleness. The neon lights outside pulsed in their usual rhythm, but for the first time, they didn't look like a warning. They were just lights in a city where they were finally, officially, nobody. The empire was gone, and in its place was a silence that didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. "Tomorrow we start over," he promised, his breath warm against her hair. "No contracts, no guards, just us." Hana closed her eyes, letting the safety of his presence wash over her. The stalker was gone. The syndicate was a memory, and the kingpin had become her husband. As the first hint of dawn began to touch the skyline, they sat together in the quiet, two souls who had traded the world for each other, and finally found that it was a bargain worth making. 6 months had passed since the night the Park Empire collapsed into the hands of those who craved its shadows, and for Hana, life no longer felt like a countdown toward an inevitable disaster. The small studio apartment was still their sanctuary, but its walls no longer felt like a fortress. They felt like a home. Daehyun had traded his armored SUVs for a modest sedan and his lethal reputation for a burgeoning career as the CEO of a legitimate technology startup, built from the remnants of his legal assets. He worked late, not over maps of contested territory, but over software code and business development plans, his sharp mind finding a new kind of power in creation rather than destruction. On a clear spring afternoon, the air smelling of rain and cherry blossoms, they stood in a small sunlight-drenched garden on the outskirts of the city. There were no high-backed chairs for syndicate representatives, no cold stares from rivals, and no legal contracts waiting to be signed in blood. The only guests were Dante, who had stayed by Daehyun's side as a legitimate head of security, and the few neighbors who had grown to love the quiet couple from the fourth floor. Hana wore a simple white dress, her hair no longer in a messy bun but falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She held a bouquet of wildflowers, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the monochromatic world she had occupied when Min-soo haunted her steps. As she walked toward Daehyun, she saw that the man waiting for her was entirely different from the predator who had stepped out of the headlights in that dark alleyway. The tension in his shoulders was gone, and the gray eyes that had once been shards of flint were now warm and clear, fixed on her with a devotion that needed no words. "When I first met you, I told you that your life belonged to me as payment," Daehyun said as he took her hands, his voice steady and devoid of its former rasp. "I was a man who only knew how to possess things, but you showed me that a life isn't something to be owned, it's something to be shared. I don't have an empire to offer you anymore, but I give you my word, my loyalty, and every day I have left." Hana felt the tears prickling her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I chose you when you were a monster because you were the first person to see I wasn't a victim," she replied, her voice trembling with the weight of their journey. "I choose you now as a man because you're the best person I've ever known. I don't need a kingpin, I just need you." They didn't exchange a gold band because of a will or a debt. They exchanged rings because they wanted the world to know they belonged to one another by choice. When they kissed, it wasn't a formal touch to satisfy a witness's scrutiny. It was the slow, deep connection of two souls who had survived the dark and finally found the light. 2 years later, the laughter of a child began to fill a larger house, one with windows that looked out over a yard where cherry trees grew. Joseph, their son, had his father's calm focus and his mother's defiant spark, a living testament to a love that had grown from the wreckage of an impossible deal. Every morning, Daehyun still brewed the coffee exactly the way Hana liked it. A small, daily ritual of service that meant more to her than any jewel. They didn't have a fairy tale, but they had something better. A life built on the decision to stay, to heal, and to choose each other every single day.